Thursday morning in Switzerland, Thursday afternoon in Australia. It's Space Café Australia time again. The Space Café Australia with Annie Handmer will begin very soon. As always, we really appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. My name is Tara Monter. I'm the event coordinator at SpaceWatch.Global and host of the Space Café Benelux, together with my co-host Banu Bazingi. Now, SpaceWatch is a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. And with Annie Handmer, we have found a great friend and a wonderful host for our outreach in Australia. And I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. Our latest episode features Barbara Belvisi of the Interstellar Lab about the future of plant growth in space and on Earth, which is really interesting. So definitely have a listen. And for all our fans of audio content, we also have new episodes of our Space Café Radio, where we talk with interesting people on the road, on shows, and at conferences. We also keep our fan shop online open for you to support us actively and become a space watcher. Edition 1 has very cool items for you, your friends, and the ones you love. And your support is needed to keep our work alive for you. Now, if you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the events section and also on our YouTube channel. And we will host our Space Café Australia live on a regular basis. With that, my job is done, and I'd like to hand you over to your host, Annie. Over to you.
G'day, Space Watchers, and welcome to Space Café Australia. Here at Space Café Australia, we share the stories of people from across our nation to document their stories and roles in Australian space. But first, it is very important to recognise the history and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples across Australia. So SpaceWatch.Global and myself would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout our country and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and we'd like to extend that respect to all Indigenous and First Nations people here today or listening later. Sovereignty was never ceded. And I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in what we now call Sydney. And I'm so excited, by my friend Troy McCann, the founder of Moonshot, a company growing technology business that leverages and integrates frontier locations into our world, ranging from physical spaces to cyberspaces. Troy's got over 13 years experience in technology and entrepreneurship, spanning multiple diverse businesses and industries, and has developed a framework for supporting the growth of commercial solutions to humanity's most difficult challenges. But of course, I, like most of us, know Troy as that guy in space who looks a lot like Keanu Reeves. So Troy, Keanu McCann, how are you?
Thanks so much, Annie. That was a great introduction. Thank you so much. I like the little Keanu Reeves bit you snuck in there. I haven't heard that one before. No, I love it. Oh, I love the compliment.
How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. Yeah. So good morning, everybody, and good evening, good night, depending on where in the world you are. I'm just thrilled to be here. I've been paying attention to the work that SpaceWatch has been doing for years now. So I'm just thrilled to be here. Hopefully, I do everyone justice.
Oh, I'm sure you'd be fantastic. We're approaching the end of the year, and Troy, I don't know about you, but I think I hit a wall around September, which is when I submitted my thesis. And since then, I have been sort of crawling through rubble towards the end of the year. And I'm at a point now where I can see the end. It's in sight. And I feel like I've got it's not even a second wind at this point. It's maybe like the eighth. But I'm really, really thrilled to have the opportunity to chat to you. I think, being Aussie and a bit casual about these things, the hope is for anyone who's joined us and anyone watching later as well, Troy and I are just going to have a chat about some things that really interest us and continue some conversations that we've been having for years, really. And you're invited to listen in, and you can chuck any questions you've got into the Q&A. But consider this like we're actually hanging out at a cafe together talking about space and money is our topic. And you just happened to be there listening in, and we're so happy that you've joined us. So thank you so much. So to kick things off, Troy, I wanted to begin on a casual kind of holiday note and ask you about what was something you've done recently that was unexpectedly fun?
Ooh, okay. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, it wasn't really anything that I did, and it's a little bit of a vanity metric, but I wrote a post yesterday, which I've never had anything go viral before, and I think you'd describe it as viral. So I wrote a post about SpaceX that I didn't think it was anything special, and all of a sudden it's got 100,000 views, and I think it's got like, I don't know, like hundreds, like I think it would just pass like 1,000 likes or something, which for me is incredible. So that has sort of been, I'm not really good with social media, and so that has sort of kept my interest in the last day or so. It's been like, oh, what happened? How did this happen? Why is everyone really liking this bit of space news as opposed to other ones? And so that's been really interesting. I've sort of been diving in, trying to learn more about the algorithms now. Because I think I was just talking to you and actually Malcolm in the audience when we were in Canberra last week about how I just don't get Twitter or LinkedIn or the social media thing. So that's been really interesting. That's probably not the answer you were looking for, but it's the first thing that came to mind.
No, not at all. Well, the thing that I did that was unexpectedly fun was I went and got my nails done last weekend with some friends, and I have not. Great. Well, thank you. I haven't set foot in a nail salon, as they call these places, for many a year. I was sort of forced into one many years ago when I got married. And I went there and I was talked into this thing called a statement nail, which I don't know if you can see this.
Is it the missing one? I was going to ask.
Yeah, okay. So it's not missing. It's a sparkly silver, but you actually can't see it. And it does just look as though someone forgot to put nail polish on it. And it's very interesting because, I would say that this is the moment at which I've realized I'm getting old. And the other moment was when I thought, actually, the statement nail is like, it's just a step beyond me, Troy. But it is exciting. And as you alluded to, so we did go down to Canberra the other week, and I wanted to actually start there with this event that was called the Southern Space Symposium. And beyond discussing the kind of, the things we don't get, for me, the statement nail, for you, the algorithm that is Twitter, what was your experience of the Southern Space Symposium?
I really loved it. To be honest, COVID's been a terrible time, but, I think for conferences, I was getting a bit of conference fatigue, especially space conference fatigue, just before COVID hit. So in Australia, I felt like we were having conferences every month or so with the same people talking about the same things. So I loved, after 2 years of having no real conferences in real person, so many people that I've met online, in the box that you're looking at me in now, where all of a sudden we're in the same room, and I met people who have had so many conversations with now. I feel like I know them really well, but never actually met them in real life. And so it was just a great experience. One, just from that perspective, to be like, oh, you're this tall, you're that tall, It's just weird.
Yeah, the altitude.
Like, well, I've already got a face to the name, but there's still something there, But so that was really exciting. But also just the topics. Like, I think that in Australia, the conversation that we're having about space has really progressed in the last couple of years as well. So it was really great to have. I mean, you'll never hear many people say this. Really great to have politicians coming along, and actually talking, with their support, bipartisan support from all the different kinds of parties. We had the ambassador from Japan came along. And he was talking about how we can collaborate and all the amazing things that are already starting to happen. So it was just a different, it was a different tone. I like to talk about like bursting the space bubble, and I feel like quite often the people who are interested in space and are working in the space sector, we do sort of form a bit of a bubble. And this is not just in Australia, it's globally as well, where it can be a little bit hard to break into that if you're from outside. And so I think this was a really, really interesting thing, because we've just got so many other people now coming in and saying, hey, this is what I can contribute to space as well. And everyone's starting to realize that, space is really this rising tide to lift all boats. It's not just for the rocket scientists, not just for the astrophysicists. It really is for everyone. So I thought it was an amazing couple of days. And it was good just to get out of the state as well. I drove down to Canberra from Sydney, which is a 3-hour drive, and that as well was just it felt like freedom after so long. So yeah, how about yourself? What did you think?
Oh, I had a great time. It was the first time I've attended an in-person conference in probably since COVID. Oh, yeah. No, there was one, but it was just such a treat to go and to see everybody. And as you say, to see how tall people are, to see like
I don't know, that sounds really weird, but
of like what people are wearing, how they've done their hair, all of those things. It was bizarre. And also like driving down, as you say, was such a really nice experience, getting out of Sydney, seeing open spaces. Lake George was full of water for those of us.
I've never seen it as a lake before. I always thought that it was a once lake, and that climate change has meant that it will never be a lake again or something. So that was really cool. For those who have no idea about Lake George, there's this part where you're probably about still an hour out of Canberra, and it just looks like a very flat plain. And you look on Google Maps because I don't know where I'm going. So you're like, well, there's supposed to be this massive body of water here, but there's just nothing. Well, this time it had turned all into water, and it was incredible. It looks like an ocean. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember this happening many, many years ago. I think maybe every 15 to 20 years this happens.
Oh, wow.
Probably
okay.
20.
So it's a cycle. Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's something to do with like La Nina. Is that how you pronounce it? I probably mispronounced it. Yeah.
I suspect it is. Yeah, but it was great. And what was really exciting was seeing so much energy in the room. As you say, we had people from politics, we had like government, we had people from the private sector, all kind of joining together. There we go. So this is very useful. Malcolm says there's an underground aquifer which floods every now and then. Thank you, Malcolm. See, this is the benefit of having people publicly eavesdrop on conversations. They can fill in gaps. So, as we go, if we're missing some obvious fact, please put it in the chat and let us know. So, yeah, I thought it was a really interesting experience. And, as someone who's working in the space sector, I wanted to get your take on what do you think is space and what isn't space? Because I've noticed there's a bit of kind of claiming of territory happening at the moment, a few arguments about what's in and what's out. What do you think? Yeah,
it's a really good question, and I think I'm going to give you a bit of an outside of the box answer to it, but I'll probably actually also answer it as well. And I think to some extent we're putting a little bit too, like a lot of people are trying to ask that question. A lot of people are answering the question and trying to force, being like, no, this is what space is, and so everyone's got these different ideas about it. I think that it kind of distracts from what we actually really need to do, which is, we've got access to these frontier locations. So how do we best make the use of them? Does it really matter to put arbitrary or, partially arbitrary definitions around, like where is it the Kármán line that dictates like where space is? Is it what's in the atmosphere outside? So I actually prefer to look at space as, look, it's really a symbol, and it's when we look up into the sky, the night sky, for example, and we see the stars, it's kind of like a positive black mirror. It's this it's this opportunity to reflect back on ourselves and to ponder our place in the universe and to be inspired by all the futuristic things that we've seen in science fiction over the last little while, and to think about how can we create a better world. So that's on like sort of the very big sort of philosophical side, I guess. But in a more practical sense, to me that sort of takes me to, well, what does it mean if you've got some sort of space station that is doing something productive, advanced manufacturing or something, and but we're now getting, say you're doing a data center, for example, so something to process a lot of data for computational things. And you're like, for whatever reason, maybe you're putting a quantum computer up there, whatever. Well, we're starting to put data centers in our deep oceans as well. The deepest depths of our oceans isn't traditionally somewhere where we would have put hardware and infrastructure either. So is that space? It's not necessarily outer space. It's kind of probably more like inner space, but it's the very similar kind of properties, right? It's a new frontier location that we haven't traditionally been to. We can't reach it really easily, so we have to design things kind of similarly. And so I think it's more helpful to look at, what are the frontier locations we have access to? How do they differ from each other? Because when we also say that space is just this single, far away location that's totally separate from the rest of our world, I'm preaching to the choir here. We all know that that's not true because we're already in this spaceship. But two, we know that low Earth orbit, for example, is entirely different to the moon, which is entirely different to the asteroid belt. And so if you're looking to do things, even just a simple mission there, let alone considering how we might do larger industry and industrial activities, they're entirely different. So we need to consider them differently. So to me, space is a little bit different. As an industry, and I'll keep this quick because I know I'm taking a while on the response here. As an industry, I think that space doesn't actually even exist as an industry anymore. I think it really, people talk about space as an industry and then they have this sort of light bulb moment. They say, oh, it's not a vertical industry. It's not like there's an aerospace. It actually spans across, agriculture, defense, mining, education, logistics, all these sort of things. They say it's a horizontal industry. I don't think that's even the case anymore. I think what we're seeing, and we have really been seeing, I think it started, decades ago, but we're only just starting to sort of see it's boiling frog syndrome, that we've got our global economy that literally has now spanned the entire planet. It's becoming so tightly interconnected between all the continents and different, if you call them civilizations and whatnot, populations, and now starting to push out into these new frontier locations. We're starting to look at, how do we use microgravity to help our firefighters more safely and efficiently battle wildfires? How do we help our farms grow their crops more efficiently using this space data and these massive eyes in the sky that can help us, see everything underneath? How do we use the microgravity environment to manufacture new drugs and medicines and medical solutions to some of our greatest problems that we simply cannot even discover or invent here down on the ground because of gravity? So it's really about the whole economy is now expanding to these new frontier locations. So it's really the space economy. There's no space industry either. And so, advanced manufacturing is something that sort of pulls into it. You've got space law, space medicine, all these things. So it doesn't really make sense anymore to say, well, space is just the rockets, the satellites, space stations, and space missions. It's really much more in depth than that.
That's a fascinating perspective. Thank you for providing it. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but as you were talking, I was thinking about my own field of academic study, which is STS, or Science and Technology Studies. And in that we talk about boundary work, which is the process by which people draw lines between this thing is in biology and that thing is in chemistry. And that kind of drawing of borders, and then the ways in which we kind of enforce those borders through structural mechanisms. And when I think about space, I often think of it as something like a boundary object itself. It's something that is constantly contested in these ways with real import. Because, well, exactly, because whether you are space or you are not space has impacts for what I want to get on to talking about with you, which is money, it's funding. And as a personal example to lead us into this, so I've just finished my PhD and I was in the Faculty of Science. Thank you. It's very exciting. So I was in the Faculty of Science, but doing something called like in the School of History and Philosophy of Science, which means that pretty much every grant that came through in the science channels would say, all science students welcome to apply for this extra funding to do whatever it is, in brackets, chemistry, physics, maths, biology, etc. And I was not on that list. And then the arts faculty would say, but you're not arts, so you're not eligible. And so you fall between the boundaries of these things. So
slip through the cracks.
Well, absolutely. But sometimes they're more like chasms. And so when you're in the Australian space sector or space economy, I like your framing of space economy. I suppose my question to you is, what is it actually like trying to navigate these narrow walkways between chasms where funding is available here but not here, and only for this amount of time, and then maybe you have to hop across to a different peak where there's more funding for a while, or whatever else? What's it like? What's the current landscape of funding?
Yeah, I think you're entirely right, and I've got to be really careful not to go down like a huge philosophical rabbit hole on the idea of boundaries and things now, because I'm just thinking the first thing I thought of was a donut, and is the whole of a donut an object, and going down that. So I'll avoid all of that, but I'd love to talk to you about that another time, and maybe we'll have to get some more people as flies on the wall to join that conversation. But bringing it back to space, you're entirely correct. The biggest example that I can think of immediately is this idea of spatial as separate to space. So for those who aren't aware of the term, like spatial, so anything to do with data that comes from space, or even just geographic information systems. So everyone's used Google Maps or Apple Maps or anything like that. But the data that's helping like I said, our farmers optimize their crops so that we can grow the food that we need to eat, and all of those different uses for space-based data. That's all under this idea of spatial. So it's everything from collecting the data from wherever, and it might come from sensors or it might come from satellites in space. Doesn't necessarily have to come from the space segment. It's about like analyzing it, machine learning, all of that sort of stuff. That's sort of clumped into that. So that's naturally you think, well, that's going to be very closely tied to the space sector. You've got people that are building satellites, and on the satellites you've got people that are developing new kinds of sensors to make sure that they get the right kind of granularity and quality and precision and accuracy of data for the people that are going to be, the customers of whoever is developing those spatial solutions. But there's this disconnect because there are a lot of funding options that sort of start to say, well, there's a lot of stuff happening in spatial, and so when we allocate some funding to space, we're going to exclude them out of it. And then you get the same thing happening in spatial. They'll say, well, actually, this just has to be for spatial and not space. And so then there's a big disconnect there. And so this value chain, of groups that is just trying to collaborate with each other, because we need to have this, information sharing about, well, what information do we really need to get? How do we design the hardware to put into space to measure it? How do we develop the software to make sure that we take that data and turn it into useful information and get it to the person? Those conversations are, there's a lot of friction involved in there now. So that's that one, and so that's quite big. But there's also, so in Australia, there's not much funding to, someone has just said, lol, what funding? They read my mind. There really isn't much funding for space stuff, or at least government spending in Australia at the moment. Now, I suspect that's going to change at the next federal budget, but we'll just have to wait and see. Some really, really positive signs, and like the Canberra conference that we were just talking about, I think that was a lot of positive signalling there. But at the moment, there really hasn't been much funding for space, and so the funding that there is, that is available. Firstly, it can sometimes seem like, if you picture some seagulls and someone's thrown chips. I think it was from Jackie from One Giant Leap. Oh, who's actually messaging at the moment.
This is great.
I was talking to her the other
Jackie.
day. This is great. We've got some engagement happening. So she's telling me, I was like, that's perfect. She's like, it's like seagulls and hot chips. And so you've got a small bucket of money that's sort of put out there, and you've got everyone trying to fit this square peg into a round hole to say, oh, look, what I'm doing actually can fit into what you've described that you want, and so I should get that. But then it also leaves out huge areas that also need support. So like STEM education initiatives, for example, are getting very much left behind as we focus on just companies that are developing the technologies. Or there's huge buckets of money. Well, relatively speaking, academics I think might disagree with it, but there's huge buckets of funding that are available to universities and even collaborative research centers and things like this. And a lot of that funding has to be spent on the academic side of things, which sort of. So this forced pooling of funding into these sort of arbitrary boxes can sometimes mean that projects and companies and initiatives don't quite get the resources that they need, and people are just slipping through these cracks all the time. It's a really difficult challenge to solve, though. I think really the best solution is how do we encourage more money to get in so that eventually these gaps do get filled up. But there's a lot more that we could do. I'll leave it at that. That's probably a whole hour of discussion alone.
It's really interesting because, of course, we hear these things, or I do. I hear, there isn't much money and it's difficult and all of that sort of thing. I'm wondering, could you take us through what is actually the process of applying for a grant or applying for government funding for something. Like from even how do you hear that it might be available through to when you might actually get the money? How long is it taking, like in an ethnographic sense? Take us through that process.
Okay, so I might step back just like a little bit and give a little bit of background to like funding channels and things like that. And so by the time I circle back around, you may need to remind me exactly what your question was. But so one of the funding options that is available, if you're looking to do something in space or just in general, you might say, great, well, is there a government grant opportunity to do that? Now, a lot of people might say, well, that's free money, and I tell you, there is nothing free in this world. So generally speaking, grants will take forever. It's actually it's a skill, it's a science, it's an art to actually complete these grant processes as well. There's a lot of politics involved, and a lot of the time, as much as they might be perceived to be open processes as well, there's politics that you don't necessarily know about, and so you spend all this time applying for a grant that you really feel that you are perfectly positioned for, but you actually you might not have even sort of any hope. So it's not really free money, because you have to do a lot of work, and there's a lot of risk involved, because you probably won't get it, depending on what it is, when it comes through. So if you're looking to do something, that's one of the options you have to say, great, well, is the government funding, and wanting to encourage people to do what I am also doing. One of the other ways is to, if you're building a business, and it can be a not-for-profit, it can operate as a charity. When I say business, I'm not saying it has to be all about hyper-capitalism or anything like that. It's about saying, look, we're in this system, so how do we produce something that is of value to somebody else, and make sure that we're creating some, actually adding value, solving someone's problem, or adding benefits to their lives. So you might say, well, can I sell something to a customer? That's a perfect way to get money into something, but then it takes some investment to begin with. So you might also say, well, can I go to get some investment from a venture capital or a private equity firm, or even you might say, can I get a loan from a bank? Generally speaking, these days, you're not going to get a loan from the bank for a business, especially not if it's anything to do with like intangible stuff like software. And even then, if you're looking to do hardware stuff in space, they'll probably say you're out of your mind. Banks are debt these days, I think, is a really tricky one unless you're going to university. They're happy to load you up with debt. But so you pretty much you're left with, okay, I want to start a company, unless I've got really wealthy family and friends around me. I'm going to have to go to some investors and pitch to them that, hey, I've got this really great opportunity. I've got a really great experience, credibility to do this thing that that no one else has really done before. I've got this team of incredible people, and we've validated this idea that we've got. So it's not just having an idea, because everyone's had an idea, great ideas, but until you've tested it in some way with people who would be real customers, people that have maybe signed real contracts that said, look, if you could deliver this, I'll give you this money, then an investor can give you funding as well. So generally what sort of happens, at least in Australia at the moment, is that you get groups that are trying to get money from these two different sources, usually venture capital, or they're looking at grants. Now, venture capital and investors in Australia and around the world are starting to warm up to this idea of space. I think they, especially in the VC sort of industry, they're generally people that want to be, seen as forward-thinking people. So they're very open to this idea of space and sci-fi-like concepts, even if they don't really understand it yet. But it has taken a while for them to become familiar with it, and to even, think about making an investment into space technology, because for most people still believe that it's sci-fi, and people just don't understand what it can actually do for us as people down here on Earth. So as a founder, a lot of the founders, especially if they're first time, they'll say, great, well, let's spend all of our time writing grants. But then you got this challenge, because to write a grant, for example, and depending on how big it is, so like in New South Wales, this is for the Aussie audience at the moment. In New South Wales, there's a startup grant, matched funding $25,000. If you provide $25,000, it's actually really easy to get. It's one of the best grant processes I've seen. You could fill out the form in about 30 minutes, and then it just takes a month for them to go do their basically due diligence, and then they send the money in your account. That's a really good one, and I've actually never really seen another grant process that simple before. You get other grant processes where it might take you, they'll say, it'll take you about 3 months because there's a lot of backwards and forwards, and that's just to apply. And because, you'll never say, all right, I'm going to write it on my own, submit it, and then just wait to see what they say. They always want to work with you to make sure that you got the best opportunity so that, so they know you're not going to waste their time and vice versa. What I've seen a lot of the time is that usually extends to maybe about 6 months, and this is time that you're not spending on building your actual thing, mind you, and then and even then you've got to wait, and so you're sitting there, and then even if you get the grant, you might be waiting for them to actually sign the contract, and you're not allowed to actually start until you sign the contract. And if it's a match funding grant, this is something I've had experience with before, where you've won a grant, and then it takes about 6 months where your money that you're contributing is also tied up, because they're not signing the grant. You're not allowed to, if you were to spend it, then then it comes out basically twice as much from the grant. So there's all these really, really tricky things. So I actually advise people, generally speaking, don't go for grants unless you already have, unless it's almost like a luxury cherry on the cake, where you've already got this great business operating, or you've already got a bunch of funding inside, whatever it is you're doing, and you say, look, we've got some extra capacity. If we were to get this extra thing, it wouldn't be us fitting a square peg into a round hole, hoping that someone's going to, help us survive or extend our runway so that we don't crash at the end of it in a couple of months. That's really the best time that you should go for it. And I feel bad for putting that out there, especially in such a public forum, but because the idea of grants is, look, the government is looking to, or whoever is trying to provide ways to encourage, a particular activity that wasn't necessarily happening before. But in reality, there's so much bureaucracy around it that it never actually pans out that way, and it just becomes, it takes a lot of your time. So I actually think, and this is happening even in Australia, but especially in somewhere like the US and around the world, it is actually so much easier to develop everything out, to start building it, and as much as it's still difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but to go and raise funding, from investors, private investors, to do that. And that's why I built Moonshot in the way that I did, because I saw that a few years ago. My background, I'm an engineer. And I had happened to build a few businesses myself where my investment was from customers. I'd never actually raised from investors before. But when I was looking at the whole system and trying to work out, how can I help more space companies around the world grow, the clear solution to me was, help private investors understand space a bit more so that they can provide the capital, because it usually flows so much quicker and easier. But there's still a lot of work to go to make that, really, really, high volume capital flow system.
It's absolutely fascinating hearing you talk about this as an insider. I think people in the chat are really enjoying it as well. We've had a few different comments come through. There's one question which was about, so Martin Sweeting once said, government funding should be enough to keep the industry hungry but not starving. How does government balance funding needs, particularly for novel solutions, with market demand? And I think this might lead on to where I kind of was hoping this conversation might go, which is, what does value actually look like in the space sector? What does it, what sort of returns are people looking for? And I think, to begin with, I'm just thinking, if you've got your private investors, say, even in the Australian context, who maybe have some spare money, maybe they're interested in investing in something, why would they choose to invest in something space? If we can use the label, having problematized it so much in the first half hour, why would they, what are they looking for? Are they looking for a return on investments? What sort of time horizon are they looking at, or is it a more of a moonshot, like it might pay off? Or I think, what sort of what does value look like?
How do you actually value it? There's a couple of, I love talking about perspectives, and I think space is a really fascinating topic to talk about perspectives, because you've got literal perspectives like satellites in Earth orbit, and like I said, you've got the perspective of reflecting back on yourself. So this one's an interesting one from perspectives, because you've got, if you take it from a pure venture capital, private equity perspective, you can take the space part out of it, and you're saying, look, as investors, what are they? They're looking to invest in things that are going to produce some sort of financial return for them in the future. So generally, what does that look like? Well, even within that, you get sort of a really broad spectrum of different people. You get some people that are, that are like, hey, I've got this capital, and I'm going to take some really big moonshot type bets, and I know that if I make 100 investments, it's really just a statistical play really on the side of the investor. If I make 100 investments, I only expect 1, maybe 2 to actually work. The rest of them can essentially fail. Not that they would like that to happen, they just know statistically that would be the case because it's going to be in an area that's so hard to do. It's usually companies that are inventing entirely new business models that didn't exist before, entirely new markets that didn't exist before, entirely new technologies that didn't exist before. So really hard stuff. But as long as 1 or 2 wins, that's why, you might have heard the term, looking for a unicorn company, a $1 billion company, because that usually is enough to have returned the value of the entire fund. And, when you're a VC, usually you're not actually wealthy yourself. You might be, but usually you're someone that says, look, I've got this sort of this thesis around what might become really valuable or what I can contribute to add value to this area in the future. So they actually go out to their partners, limited partners, and they say, hey, give me some of your money. Are you looking to invest it somewhere? It's like, give that to me. So they're actually investing other people's money, kind of like a startup founder who's building a company for investment. They're going to investors saying, hey, give me some of your money, I'll make it valuable. So it's really just sort of that's how it works. I think a lot of even like founders don't quite realize that. They just think that investors have these massive buckets of money and it's just all there. So that's on one side where they're like, yep, I really love this idea. I'm passionate about the team, and I would love to see this future that this person is trying to build. On the other side, you've got, the real sort of traditional, private equity type things where they'll be looking at all of the financial, metrics of that business that they can find and analyzing it, applying a whole lot of statistics and maths and things like this to try to work out what they think the company should be valued at. And the raw theory just says, look, a company's value or a share, the market cap of a company is worth the sum of all of its future cash flows. And that kind of makes sense. But the question is, how do you do that for a company that is still doing R&D, that hasn't even got any track record yet? And so does that mean that you shouldn't invest in it because it's a terrible investment? And there's a lot of investors that would say, yeah, you shouldn't. And they're sort of on this side of the spectrum. But then you get a lot of the investors on this side that say, look, what we're actually doing, we're not, if we invest $100,000 into a startup and say, well, it's for 10% of the company. Yes, the math says that that's then worth $1 million, but it's not as though they're saying, look, we've looked at the financials and we believe that the cash flows mean that that's worth $1 million. They're saying, look, we know it's not worth anything really, but we know that if we give you this $100,000 now, you'll be able to do something with it that proves to us that you can get a little bit closer to where we need to go, and then maybe we'll invest again and we'll bring some of our friends on board as well to take you to the next stage, and so you can bring us to the next stage. And so they're actually buying a discount for in the future for when that company's doing well. They've actually got some customers, they've got those numbers, those financial numbers. What they're trying to do is say, look, I now have the stake in this great company, and this company is producing these great numbers that wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't have done this at the very beginning. So they're very different mindsets. They're coming at it from different perspectives. Now, how does that all apply to space? Well, it's because space is usually operating on this side. At Moonshot, we've seen some companies that from very early on have been able to generate revenue, and they've got customers straight up, because there are actually a lot of opportunities for some software-based space companies. So one of our favorites is and again, we literally invested in them, just full disclosure. So Alula here in Sydney, so they're developing this platform to aggregate spatial and space data from satellites and create a platform that basically means that it's cheaper and easier and more efficient for customers to get that. And it also means that for the satellite operators, they're able to sell more of their space data where they wouldn't have been able to before. So they're an example of a company where they've actually got revenue, and you can look at what their monthly recurring revenue is and how it's going up, and you can fine tune all these things. But a lot of space companies, especially if they're doing hardware, don't have that luxury. You look at SpaceX, for example, as an extreme example of a company that everybody knows. And while they do have customers, they've got government contracts and commercial contracts to put satellites in space, this sort of thing. Their expenses are still so much higher, and their R&D costs are still so great that they're really still a startup. And they're nowhere near cash flow positive on the operations side, and they're just reinvesting a lot of that back in. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad company. I was having this conversation with someone loosely yesterday on LinkedIn, because they were sort of saying, how profitable are they? And I'm like, but it doesn't really matter, because the promise and the belief of the investors that are putting money into it is saying, look, we know that it's not generating profit now, but we're investing thinking that we'll get, expecting that we'll get a discount in the future on this really valuable thing that has had this amazing impact on the world and enabled us to grow, a lot of value from that. So coming again, so what is value? So what it really means, I think, in simplest terms is, something that solves someone's problem, where you say, great, I'm going to give you a little bit of money because, I'll give you $1 for this thing because for me, it's actually worth $1.10. And that's how business should work. So when we're launching satellites into the sky, we don't necessarily think, well, that satellite is directly giving me a lot of value, but down that supply chain, yes, it eventually does, because it means that when you switch on the TV in the morning to see what the weather's going to be, to know whether you should be, getting your umbrella out or not, that's extra, that's value that you get from that, and so that all accumulates and yeah. I'll stop there because I'll just keep rambling otherwise. But I think I have done. No. I think I've covered. I think I've covered most of it. In a nutshell.
It's a great response. So I in a previous life I was in finance. I worked in investment banking, and on my team we did general industrials and sponsors, which is private equity. So I'm with you on this. I mean, you have some companies, like some private equity companies, who are just looking for the 3 to 5 year exit. They're going in with some sort of leveraged situation. They're looking for targeting a particular return on investment. They're assessing the fundamentals. They're looking at the company. They're like, where can we cut costs? Yep. What can we do to basically, pay off the debt and then take the equity and run? That's one model of investment. And I think that's often what people have in mind. Investment can be not just kind of that really simple fiscal thing. It could actually be investment in kind of a broader sense of value, as you say, like the value of having access to that data, or the value of even some sort of emotional involvement as well. And like increasingly, I think people are beginning to realize that things have value because we believe they have value, not necessarily because there's some fundamental value there. Although, obviously that's a controversial topic. So we have a question from Stephen Freeland, and we've invited Stephen on to ask live.
Now
Stephen,
I'm very nervous. What's Stephen going to ask? Stephen's a mentor of mine, and I think of him so highly. So I'm a little bit scared now.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Stephen.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Troy and Annie. This is such a great discussion. It's fantastic, and it should go on for hours. And my question was a little off point, and I apologise for that, but it's a point of interest for me, particularly given the work that I'm doing at the UN side. You spoke about, Troy and Annie, about the space economy, and you gave a really good explanation of why we should do it, and we all know how it's growing exponentially and all of that. But as you know, there's talk now about a cislunar economy and off-Earth economy, looking at different types of activities, obviously. And I just wonder what your views are on that. I mean, it's been put to me that, of course, this is a wonderful and logical extension, but if there's an off-Earth economy, that, for me to be a customer of yours, both of us have to be wealthy, essentially, and developed. Because so I just wonder, is it a logical extension of what you're talking about? And if it is, where is? And I really ask the question. I don't have fixed views. Where is the value, and who benefits, and how does it fit in? So anyway, sorry to be off point, and it's a great discussion. No. Thanks so much, and I love you both. You're just wonderful.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right, well, I'll dive straight into it. No, that was actually a fantastic question, and something that I'd love to talk about, because I truly do believe that things that we do in space, we're here on Earth at the moment, for now. So the value that's created anywhere has to eventually come to us. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it, right? Even so if it's a matter of us putting more satellites in space, it's because we're generating data to bring back to us down here on Earth. If we are manufacturing novel medicines that you can't do here on Earth, that's because we want to have a way, or we hope that we'll have a way, if we're doing that, to bring them back down to Earth, where we are, to solve our problems here. So I think that there's a lot of talk about the billionaires space race, and this kind of thing. And while there kind of is a space race, but I think it frames things in the wrong way, because yes, traditionally, you've needed a lot of money to get into space. And maybe in another question that I can ask myself, I'll answer about how, I think it's just amazing that the average person now in a global north nation can get into space themselves, and that's how I got started myself, and so many others that I know. But I digress. So space activity, yes, is quite expensive, but to run it as a business, and a lot, I don't know of any space billionaire or even space multi-millionaire or anyone who is not at least convincing themselves in their own minds, saying that it's not a philanthropic endeavor. It's because they want to create, they see a future of the world that they see as positive, and they're trying to create that. Even this idea of space tourism is especially recently put in a very, very negative light. But when they were coming up with these concepts, it's because they wanted to help people see the overview effects and have new perspectives and all this kind of thing. And at the same time, the exception to this rule so far is Blue Origin, because they haven't necessarily launched any satellites into space. But take a company like SpaceX, for example, or and now Astra and this sort of thing. They're launching rockets not just because it's really cool and that's a great benefit of it for PR, but because we're able to put more amazing space infrastructure in space to solve our problems down here on Earth. I've been talking online a lot in recent weeks about how I'm excited about what it means for us to have several private space stations that'll be hopefully up and running by the end of this decade, because then that means it will have a lot of people doing things like in-space manufacturing of new kinds of medicines using that microgravity environment, or even I'm really fascinated in this idea of advanced manufacturing and microchips and things like this, using the very clean space that we have naturally out there at a time where our ability to launch rockets into space means that price per kilogram is exponentially decreasing. So there's a lot of activity that we're doing here on Earth, consuming biological resources and water and things like this, that I think we can actually stop doing. We can keep our this spaceship Earth more pristine by moving that off Earth, and then also closer to the other planets where we might have other settlements and populations as well. So I think that's a really interesting way of sort of looking at things. But so at the moment, if you look, and this is why I said at the very beginning of this talk, I think we need to break up space into and consider it a little bit more in depth than just saying, look, everything beyond the atmosphere is space. Because if you're doing lunar activity, you've got companies today, or say, you've got companies that aren't necessarily businesses yet, because they're trying to say, all right, I'm going to develop a lunar rover, and we're going to mine helium-3 from the lunar regolith, and we're going to bring that helium-3 back to Earth, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that it might be worth around this. Or we're going to go and mine this diamond asteroid, because everyone's seen that article that always floats around online saying there's $1 trillion asteroid out there. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there is no $1 trillion asteroid out there, because you can't mine that asteroid of the diamonds and sell it to anybody who wants it. There is no market there for that yet. You would have to bring it back to Earth, and then it would change the prices and all that sort of thing. So when we see this, all these activities popping up around, okay, we're going to go to Mars and we're going to go to the Moon, and they're government funded, it changes things a little bit, because that's where the governments have decided, okay, we need to put some money into this because we can see value of doing this activity, and we need to build a foundation for private industry and a free market to build on top of. So eventually, yes, maybe there will be a helium-3 market where we can go and mine that stuff there. But we know that a business today or a company today can't go and do that themselves. Even the most wealthy person in the world, Elon Musk, still needs government support to get to Mars, for example. He can't do that on his own, and the only way he can do that is by convincing and selling a story around all the value that could come from us being at Mars. What does that mean for humanity and for life on Earth, currently on Earth, if we do that? So that's where things get interesting. I think private investment is much more usually shorter term looking on when they expect their returns, and that usually means that we have to have value here on Earth. Even if we had settlements of, say, 1 million people living on Mars, for example, it would be quite small. So we need it's about where people are actually seeing real value, and that's really ultimately what it'll always come to. I don't think you'll ever get billionaires or governments or anyone just doing space activity just for the sake of it, unless it's, well, I mean, I guess some people might argue that the SLS program in the US is a glorified jobs program, considering that. But I know that's a very controversial thing. But it is an interesting perspective to consider as well. Is it just keeping their workforce up to scratch on the latest space technologies and things like this, knowing that there is potentially better private options on the horizon. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I want to talk and go down all these different rabbit holes in this conversation. So Stephen, hopefully I've kind of addressed your question there, but I'd be fascinated to have more of a conversation with you about it later, because I've got so much more that I could talk about.
We're going to have to do this again.
We're going to have to.
This is the only answer to this. Just thinking about what you're saying there, Troy, I mean, if I might weigh in briefly on it, of course, there's one story, which is that maybe government is persuaded by the narrative of off-Earth being great for Earth. The other option is, of course, that it's just another arm of the military-industrial complex that can prime the economy and create jobs and growth and also prepare for conflict, which I think is a less. It's not as pleasant to fall asleep to as a thought,
sure.
But it's one that probably ought to be under consideration. And on that note, I think we have Malcolm also on the line with a question. Speaking of military stuff, Malcolm, how are you? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. And the ironic thing is, timing is everything. I think Stephen and I asked the same question simultaneously in the question and answer box. So, Troy, you've kind of answered all the points I was going to ask in terms of the economic side of things. But, thank you, Annie, for bringing in the military side of things, because I think this is a really interesting aspect. We are sort of facing a more contested space domain, where space competition is going to extend from the LEO to GEO out to the cislunar. Looking forward 10, 20, 30 years, what does that look like, and how does the commercial sector support that military environment and those military activities in the same way that a commercial activity on Earth supports military and defense activities? So let me rephrase my question from the one that's already been answered to essentially, what's your thoughts on how that military dimension might affect things in terms of making it easier or harder for commercial companies and startups to be able to get into the space sector, particularly if the dreams of the space billionaires do actually come true, and certainly in the 2030s and the 2040s, we are a spacefaring, space-based civilization with manufacturing in space and space planes and reusable rockets getting into space for $2 million a launch and all of those things. How does it change the economics of it from a defense and military perspective?
Yeah, so fantastic question. And I feel like this is, again, one of those questions where I'm like, I want to sit down and write like a whole thesis around this, because I think there's so many different aspects that I'm suddenly thinking of, and I want to try to encapsulate somehow. But so here we go. So I think I'm an engineer, and I love this concept of feedback loops quite a lot. And I think a lot of the phenomena that we sort of see, especially even around politics and just how we sort of collaborate with one another as people and as nations and things like this, they're actually feedback loops where we might not necessarily realize it. So I think a lot of people see we've got like in the US you've got the Space Force, and there's a lot of talk, and and a lot of people are sort of thinking, oh no, that's bad, the militarization of space, and we're seeing a lot of the really wealthy billionaires
I think I was trying to figure out, is it Troy or I who have frozen? And Malcolm's just answered that question by saying Troy got hit by space debris. We've got no's in the chat. Well, we'll hope that Troy can get back to us very quickly. Torsten, I think, will be on that. Oh, Stephen says he might be off to mine an asteroid. I might pick up where Troy left off for a second, and hopefully he can rejoin us very quickly. Lost in space, says Jackie from One Giant Leap. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this question of, there's Troy. This question of the whole idea of the military uses of space and value, I think it's important to ask, to what extent is it valuable to us to have conflict in space? And is there more long-term value in perhaps government taking a more regulatory approach, spending more time seriously trying to prevent that from happening, rather than spending that time and money preparing for it? So in a sense, if you spend too much time preparing for war, then you end up with war. I don't want to invoke Malcolm's ire here, but I will say that very shortly there'll be a thesis available online, which is the thesis I just wrote, which touches on these issues in terms of dual-use technologies and might be worth having a look at. Malcolm says that he wants to read it. Well, I think I'm uploading it tomorrow, so it should be on the website pretty soon, maybe just after Christmas, I expect. But I hope you've been enjoying the conversation. We'll just pretend that Troy got up and, went to the bathroom or something. Alice wants to read it too. Alice, yes. And Thomas, you're all wonderful. Troy, are you back? We thought you might have gotten hit by space debris.
Yeah, I think maybe, yeah, like a neutron has caused a bit flip in my computer or something. I'm not sure. Zoom just closed. I don't know why. Anyway, hopefully I'm back.
This happens. This absolutely
it does happen
happens.
Occasionally. Yeah.
Let's just imagine that we were at the cafe and a glass of water was spilt across the table and everyone had to get up and panic for a little while, and now we're back.
Yeah. Oh no.
So I've been feeling poorly by talking broadly about conflict and space and the role of government. Torsten says that's what happens when talking about the military space. It's very true. But I think where you left off was you were discussing the intersection between commercial, military, space, all of those things. Would you like to carry on?
Yeah. So I really think that there's a lot of feedback loops in sort of what we do. So part of the great thing about going to space is that we have this value that space should be democratized, should be open to everybody, and that's really what I think the private sector getting to space is. So I think we focus a little bit too much on the really, really wealthy billionaires and what they potentially might do. We sort of forget about the student groups now that for $20,000 to $25,000 to $50,000 are able to actually build a satellite and put that into space and to do some incredible things with that to solve some great problems. Now, as we do that more and more, I think the military is starting to think about, well, when you put things in orbit, they naturally float around the entire Earth. Sorry, they don't float, they fall around the entire Earth. And so it's a little bit different to anything that we've had before. So, they're starting to question, well, similar to like with cybersecurity, how, if you're a citizen of a nation, how should the military or whoever protect those private assets, of their citizens? So that's something that's already being questioned. We got these talks around, how do we monitor what sort of debris there is in space? For example, how do we do better space situational awareness so that we know how to move our, satellites out of the way of one another as we're putting hundreds of thousands of them up now. I think we've probably all heard about the Russian ASAT test that was conducted a little while ago, really irresponsibly. So now there's a whole lot more debris at a really, really critical altitude, flying around there, faster than bullets. And so there really is this aspect of, it's not necessarily the militarization, it's how do we protect these critical pieces of infrastructure? Because even if they're privately owned, let's say, you've got a private company that's launching a small constellation of satellites, telecommunications, and then there's suddenly a bunch of farmers across your country that are relying on them to conduct their operations. That's critical infrastructure. So what happens if someone hacks into it? What happens if someone blows it up with an ASAT? So we do need to. So we're starting to see the need for more of this kind of militarization. and we're starting to need to think about, how, like, where do we draw the line? How do we be careful? Because everything we put up there is always going to float above all of our heads. So it's not like we've got these walls that sort of expand from the edges of the map of whatever land we say this is our land, another arbitrary line. There is none of that in space. So so that's a big part of it. So I think, we can all imagine like Star Wars and the interesting philosophical things that come out of like watching Star Trek, for example, around the military, in this future where we're all in space and there's all these great things happening. But I think it really is still just going to be an extension of what already happens here at the moment, where we all do now have assets. I mean, not individually, hopefully one day that'll be really cool. But we do have assets in space, and they do need to have, some sort of protection there by our governments. And we do need to have these mechanisms in place so that, between governments, we can start to negotiate and make sure, okay, how do we make sure that things are secure for us, for you? How do we make sure that we're agreeing on how we should behave and act as we go up into space? I feel like there was more to the question that Malcolm asked that I have maybe left out or forgotten. So if someone wants to jump in to ask me to elaborate any further, please do, because it's a topic that I'm really fascinated by. It's
really, really interesting to think about that kind of role of government, I think. What's underlying a lot of what we're talking about and the questions coming through now in the Q&A, and I'm conscious we will have to at some point wrap up, but I do want to have this last little morsel of conversation, a final little biscuit on the side of the coffee, which is, what is the role of government? So if we think about the rise of neoliberalism in Australia in particular, we saw this idea that government's job is to create the conditions for industry to thrive, but by and large to get out of the way and let industry get on with things and kind of promote privatization of various aspects of society. That, I think, might, in Australia at least, have come to some sort of an ebb with the most recent COVID in particular, which really saw the rise particularly of state government as an important force, and a growing consciousness of society and what that actually means. What does it actually mean for government to govern? And to an extent, if we pay taxes, what are we expecting in return? So what do we expect from our government? What services are we prepared to pay for versus what do we expect to be given as a kind of, we've already paid for this? That question, I think, is fundamental to space, because there is this long history in the US of old space, which was government chucking loads of money at this thing.
Yeah.
Now there's a sense in Australia that we can just skip that. We can go straight to NewSpace, and we have private investors. We have this great space economy that will develop and do its own thing. But in that world, I think the question remains, and it's been touched on by a few people, for where does government fit? And maybe where government fits is if government is not, say, the investor or necessarily the customer, although maybe government sometimes is, then surely there has to be regulation. Like, government has to be fulfilling that role of engaging in those international fora and protecting that crucial infrastructure as a matter of just simple governmental responsibility. I wonder whether or not this is something that has been realized. Like, is this something that will only click when some critical infrastructure is damaged, and then there'll be a resurgence? Because we have we had some questions in the chat, and the answer is we have treaties. We have international UN organizations set up to discuss these things. We have mechanisms by which agreements can be reached and by which complaints can be raised. There's just a kind of awkwardness around the edges. No one wants to be the first on the dance floor. So from that perspective, as someone working in the private sector, what do you think optimally the role of government should be, at least in New South Wales or in the Australian space sector?
So there's so many parts to pick apart on that, and unfortunately my pen ran out of ink at the time where I was trying to like make notes to keep tabs on the different bits. So let's see if I can go through it. So I think that you're right. So one of the things, so like I said, I'm not a lawyer at all or anything like that. I'm an engineer, but I have been fascinated by the law from my introduction into space because of this idea is like, oh, how does international law work? Okay, it's really just nations, agreeing on how to behave with one another and coming to some sort of collective agreement as to how we should act. And so, yes, we have these international treaties and things like this, but I think we're also sort of starting to recognize that there's some nations that don't necessarily hold the same values or even necessarily the same respect for those norms. And so when we've got the Outer Space Treaty and other various treaties, and we're starting to see that even within the private sector that we're talking about, different countries, we're starting to see cracks. There's loopholes in there. There's things that so there's all these discussions happening that have to keep up with the pace of technology and development that's happening. And as we've seen in a lot of other industries, that's probably just not going to happen. So how do we best deal with that? So we do need to come up with, there's still a lot of work to be done on the regulatory side, which is fantastic on, if you're trying to get into space law or space policy, I think, because now the question is, how do we make sure that there's the jobs there? How do we make sure that the government understands that that's what they should be spending money on, or even how do they choose what to spend money on? And I think without wanting to get too, without wanting to mansplain anything, because I don't know how any of this really works. But, in a democracy here, we elect our government. So it's sort of like our government's policies are really, ideally, designed by committee. And yes, we have a representative government, and sometimes that's not always the case, but, oversimplified, like it's designed by committee. And so politicians and MPs and senators are constantly thinking about, okay, what's going to keep me voted in, in the next election? So what is the general perception of the people in my electorate, so that I can make sure that I push that for my policy. And so that's a big part of it. Now, I think something really interesting happened in Australia during COVID, which I think you alluded to, which is where the states sort of suddenly had a lot more power because our federal government decided we're just going to step back a little bit, which I think is really interesting because I believe that the idea of having states in a federation, whether you're talking about the United States of America, or you're talking about the Commonwealth of Australia or any federated group, is that you have this mechanism to have different states run different policy experiments, and I think that's effectively what we saw now. Which is a really, really cool thing because I hope, we're all kind of scientifically minded. The more experiments you run, the more data you have, and you can work out what works, what doesn't. You preferably don't want to run experiments on live, on real people in real time. But sometimes we don't always have that opportunity. And so that's what we saw. But one of the unfortunate results of that is all of a sudden you get a lot of interstate competition. So one of the other things that we're seeing happen between states with regards to space in Australia is so much competition and so much reinventing of the wheel between state spending. You've got multiple states in Australia now just throwing money and saying, we're going to launch a CubeSat. And let's be honest, they're not really doing anything that useful or special. They just really want to plant a flag and say, our state's launched a CubeSat. And we did it in one case. One of the premiers, they even put in their press release at the time when they were announcing it, I can't remember the exact wording, but I'll paraphrase something like, and we're doing it before other state, something like a week before or something like that. So there's this competition. I think that a little bit of competition can be good sometimes, but I think in the case of Australia, where we're trying to grow a space economy, where we have to leapfrog, we have to try to keep up with the rest of the world, because we know that our entire and everyone's economies will increasingly rely on space technology and space infrastructure. So if we don't have this capability now, we're going to be, we better hope that we keep being the lucky country, and we've got a lot more iron ore to be dug out of the ground, because the coal, no one wants to buy coal anymore. Good. But the only reason why our dollar has any real value is because of things like iron ore at the moment. So we need to diversify our economy a little bit. Hopefully space can help with that. So we need to come together and work out, how do we collaborate? How do we create an ecosystem across Australia that can be internationally competitive and create real things of value to offer the rest of the world? But at the moment, we have a lot of state governments leading poorly by example, I think, creating these competitive tensions between different state-based space economies. where we're not seeing as much collaboration as we want. And in fact, because there's competition, that's wasted time, effort, resources going into that competition here. Meanwhile, the rest of the world's moving on and, and doing amazing things. So while, it was great in 2018 when we set up the Australian Space Agency, and I'm really looking forward to what comes next. And there was COVID in there as well, for sure. But we have a tendency as Australians to want to be sort of separate from the rest of the world. We think that we're on the other end of the earth, and we literally are. But I think during COVID, we've also sort of, not necessarily been keeping pace with the progress of other nations with regards to space. We really need to catch up. So we need, it'd be great for the states to say, yep, we need to be a little bit more collaborative, for the federal government to work out how can they play their role in trying to get the states to collaborate a little bit more. But of course, you never want to go too far. Bringing this back to the last question I was sort of answering around, if you only have one set of policies and one perspective and one suggestion on what we should be doing, then there's also no scope for diversity of opinion, diversity of solutions to challenges and things like this. So you always do want to have some sort of level of balance and competition. It's a really tricky balancing act, especially in a democracy where we've got elections and things like this always happening all the time. So hopefully that gives everyone an insight into how I see the absolutely chaotic situation we're in. I don't necessarily have any solutions as to how we can best do that, but that's just how I see the world at the moment.
A really good answer, I think, Troy, to a very difficult question. Now, I'm aware we've got a bit over time. Troy, have you got another 5 minutes, or do you have to head off?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
We have one final question that we'll answer, and then we will actually wrap up, because we do have things to do aside from talking about space. But do we, is the question. So
but do we really?
The final, I don't know, actually. Sometimes I'm like, do I actually have anything I'd rather do? Probably not. But the final question is from Nate Taylor. Nate, are you online? Can we hear you?
Yes, I am.
Hey, would you like to ask a
Nate.
question?
I would, yeah. Thank you very much for the discussion, guys. It's been brilliant to hear. And my question is kind of in the spirit, Troy, of what you're talking about before in terms of collaborative agreements or coming together in order to solve some of these challenges. And for a long time prior to this ASAT test, there's been, I think, recognition of people being responsible actors in space. So my question is, how do you think initiatives like the Space Sustainability Rating are going to influence the viability and value of commercial space activities in the future? And if you think about this in combination with regulation, is that actually going to present significant barriers potentially for startups to actually enter the market? And probably more interestingly, I think, would be if you think about deep space missions as well.
Yeah, so I want to give you such a deeper answer. So what I'm going to give you a short answer to be respectful of everyone's time, but I'm also going to say join us at chat.moonshotspace.co if you want to have more of this conversation, because this is actually what we talk about, this kind of stuff over there. So if I would simplify your question, it's around, regulations and how do we establish regulations that are both favorable, we want them, but, how do we make sure that we're also not stifling innovation and things too much? Would that be correct? I know it's probably oversimplified, but.
Yeah, that's in the essence of what I'm talking about, yes.
Yeah, so I think, regulations are super important, especially when we're doing something like space, because we know that if someone does act in bad faith, well, then it spoils it for everyone. We've got, the places in low Earth orbit and pretty much all the Earth orbit really are a commons. And so we have to look after it, or we spoil it for everyone, and that'll be, hundreds of years before anybody can use it, which is a really, really bad thing. So, now that we're starting to see companies, for example, put in applications just to almost like domain squatting on the internet or something like that, you have up to 2 years before you actually have to do something with an application you put in to say, I want to launch a satellite to this location. And so this is causing a lot of issues around, well, what if someone else wants to use that? What if you're someone else from a different country that, the space industry isn't quite as developed yet? Is it unfair that, in 20 years' time, when it would be ready, all of a sudden all of the most ideal places have been taken up and so you don't have an opportunity to sort of rise above and this sort of thing. So I think that there's definitely some scope for regulation. How we come to that is a really tricky thing, both, as in, on a national level, because we have to understand, well, how are we going to restrict ourselves so that we can make sure that things are as fair as they can be, because you don't necessarily have a crystal ball to see what you're trying to. It's almost like if you could travel into the future to see what bad things could happen, you could go back and say, great, let's address that. But we're trying to sort of have that crystal ball without knowing what that looks like. And so you don't really know yet what the impact of putting that regulation in place might be. So if we, for example, enforce people to say, all right, everything you have to do has to be, well, I would say, quote, sustainable, and there's some really clear definitions as to what that might be. All of a sudden, that means to start a new rocket company, for example, you might not be able to do that because you're not going to be able to raise enough capital, or you have the resources right from the get-go to do that. And I think what we generally see, once we have a new industry that sort of develops is, down the track, some of the bigger companies will push for regulations, because then it means that everyone else, newcomers get blocked out of the market. So regulation can be a double-edged sword. We've got to be really careful about it, but of course it's also really essential. So I'm glad that we're having these conversations about, how do we make sure that when we go in space, it's sustainable? How do we make sure that when we do it's good? How do we make sure that we're doing the right thing? Because I'll try to wrap up this entire discussion we've had so far. It's really important that as humanity goes into space, that we make sure that we're taking the values and our beliefs, of the way that we think, that humanity should act, as we go into space. We need to, actions speak louder than words. So when we go into space, we need to actually do what we believe, and it's not just it's not enough to just sit around and talk about it, and it's not enough to sit back and while others and go and do their thing as well. So we need to move forward with that, That wasn't as tight as I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a much more tighter thing to finish on, but I'm sorry. I'll do it again another time.
This is the nature of a cup of coffee of an evening here in Australia. It's a little bit looser than we might always hope. But
it's casual.
Troy, thank you so much for those final words and for this discussion. I've enjoyed this so much. I kept forgetting that we were that other people were involved. Like I've kept just getting so engrossed in the conversation. It's been really lovely.
My pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think at this point, I will hand back over to Kiara, who will tell you about all the things coming up next. But Troy, lovely to see you, and thank you.
No, you too, Annie, and thank you, everybody, everyone in the audience, for great questions and for being a great audience, and thanks very much, Torsten and Kiara, for hosting me. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, huge thank you to both of you. It's been so interesting to listen, and so much food for thought. I mean, you could have continued for another hour or so. And what a way to end our year, because this was our last event for 2021. But our new year will already start with some very exciting events. We're going to kick off on the 4th of January at 9:30 a.m. CT, 7:30 p.m. ADT, with our 33 Minutes with Alice Gorman, who's actually in the audience right now. So that's fantastic. Really looking forward to this. Then on the 11th of January at 4 p.m. CT, we will have our 33 Minutes with Professor Anke Kaiser-Pisala. Then, quite exciting, on the 13th of January at 9 a.m. CT, there will be a panel discussion on outer space and international arbitration, which is organized by the Space Arbitration Association and hosted by us here at SpaceWatch.Global. On the 18th of January at 4 p.m. CT, we have our 33 Minutes with Peter Holsroyd. And following that, on the 25th of January at 4 p.m. CT, we will have 33 Minutes live from the EU Space Conference. And then, very exciting, on the 27th of January at 9:30 a.m. CT, again 7:30 p.m. ADT, we have our next Space Law Breakfast by Stephen Freeland, who's also, I think he had to leave already, but he's also asking great questions. So, as always, all our events are going to be online on Eventbrite. And again, we love to hear your feedback, so please do check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our bi-weekly and daily newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves to something special, become a Space Watcher today. Your support helps us greatly. Just take out your credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. I know we say this a lot, but we do need your support to continue our work. Thank you all so much for your interest today and for asking all of these great questions. A huge thank you to Annie and Troy for this inspiring talk and for being our guests. Thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing that great job week in and week out. And I hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you all in the new year. And in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, enjoy your holidays, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher.